Okay, we're near the end, both of lockdown, thank goodness. The end's in sight there as we approach a point where we can see things opening up again. People will be able to get haircuts and get out and about again. Also approaching the end of the first lesson on democracy, which we've been looking at. So we've looked so far at what liberal democracy is, definitions of democracy, criticisms of direct democracy and representative democracy, and strengths. And we've also looked at generally at a thing called the participation crisis. Today, in this video, I'd like to look at the democratic deficit. Now, the democratic deficit is a term which was coined to criticise the EU. So it's originally a journalistic observation about the EU, and it's something of all the reasons for Brexit. One of the reasons people gave, all the reasons for people wanting to leave Brexit, wanting to leave Europe, or objecting to belonging to Europe, was its lack of democracy, its so-called democratic deficit. Democratic deficit just means a lack of democracy, or a failure of democracy. And it is a bit open-ended. It's become a kind of catch-all phrase. Originally aimed at the EU, it meant that the EU had considerable influence and power with rather opaque democratic processes, or processes which could be considered not very democratic. For instance, the EU had a parliament, which wasn't the primary legislative body of the EU. That was the Council of Ministers and the European Council. So that it had an apparently unelected commission that could propose legislation, a parliament that couldn't pass legislation. It could veto legislation, it could veto the budget, it could propose legislation, but it couldn't make legislation. So we had a very curious elected parliament that was very weak, an indirectly elected or appointed commission. In other words, these were people appointed by governments. So these were the faceless bureaucrats in a way, the commission, or all the people that supported the commission. And then you had the Council of Ministers, and they tended to be elected politicians from individual countries. We also had processes of outvoting countries, such as the qualified majority voting, so that countries could have laws imposed upon them. So there began to be a perception that the EU was gaining influence and power, but was insufficiently democratic. So there was a democratic deficit. Since then, the term democratic deficit is generally applied to democracy in the UK, or anywhere you can see as a kind of failure of democracy. This would be an example of a democratic deficit. And in a way, you can sum up part of the view of the democratic deficit with the idea encapsulated by a view of an early 20th century writer and wit and journalist called H.L. Mencken. And H.L. Mencken said, to solve the problems of democracy, you need more democracy. And solving the problems of democracy with more democracy, it was humorous, and it was meant a bit facetious. He wasn't a great fan of democracy. My absolutely favourite H.L. Mencken quote, early 20th century, is when he says, "One day the American people will get their heart's desire and elect a complete moron to the White House." Well, goodness me, that was in the early 20th century, to see that actually come true. Extraordinary. Anyway, so one aspect of democratic deficit, there's insufficient democracy in our democracy. We need more democracy. But it could also generally just mean failure of democratic processes, that the processes we've got are themselves lacking democratic accountability, democratic responsiveness, democratic oversight. So anywhere you see a sort of failure of democracy, you can call it the democratic deficit, or we have a democratic deficit. From this point onwards, you could really get into a very, very long video, which I don't intend this one to be. And for instance, the things that tend to be aimed, the target of the democratic deficit are the undemocratic bits of the UK's political system. For instance, our voting system, first past the post. We touched on that on the participation crisis, how that might be used to explain why people don't vote, for instance, because our voting system is unfair, because millions of votes are unwasted. And when we look at first past the post, its strengths and weaknesses. For those of you who see the weaknesses particularly, will say there's an example of the democratic deficit, an unfair voting system. You could point to also the dominance of the House of Commons in Parliament, and the dominance of Parliament over the rest of the country. A highly unitary system, weak local government, weak devolved governments, and point to a democratic deficit. You could also point to the way that Parliament itself is dominated by the executive, and use phrases like the famous elective dictatorship. And that was a man called Quentin Hogg, later became Lord Hailsham, or actually he was Lord Hailsham, when in 1976, I believe, he said in a BBC lecture, I think it was a Dimbleby lecture, he coined the phrase that the elective dictatorship. And although that's a sort of paradoxical thing, it can't exist in elective dictatorship, it's an oxymoron. You can't have an elective dictatorship, I would guess. What he meant was that in Britain, we elect governments, we elect a parliament which hands all its power over to an executive. Executive dominates parliament. Parliament can do almost anything because of the principle of the sovereignty of parliament. So in Britain we have elective dictatorships. So the dominance of the government over parliament could be seen as a democratic deficit. Governments are insufficiently checked or limited or accountable, but especially between elections where they can pretty much do as they please. Goes that argument. Under the heading of the democratic deficit, just the impact of elites and pressure groups. So the democratic deficit, and we have a deficit because increasingly money plays an important part in our elections, the funders of political parties, because trades unions and businesses can use financial influence, and because trades unions themselves and pressure groups themselves tend to be poorly democratically accountable. The internal democratic processes of trades unions or pressure groups can be open to question. For instance, most trades union leaders are elected with a tiny amount of the membership actually involved in the election. They're generally elected by postal votes, and most people don't bother to reply. So, for instance, Len McCluskey, the head of Unite Union, one of those powerful unions in the country, was elected by 17% of the members of Unite. So say, here's a big organisation with a powerful boss, elected by a tiny percentage, very undemocratic, democratic deficit. Low turnouts can be an example of democratic deficit. Alienation from politics can be an example of democratic deficit. Failure to join political parties can be a democratic deficit. Clicktivism and checkbook activism, where people simply, give some money to a pressure group or a cause, and that's them participating in politics. Or click on something from 38 degrees, say, I agree with that, click, I agree with that, click, I like that, click. And that's a form of very perfunctory, very casual political participation. You can say, well, that sort of thing is an example of democratic deficit. The impact, you might point to the impact of new media and social media organisations like Facebook. How democratically accountable is Facebook? How democratically accountable? They have a tremendous influence. Before that, people said the same things about newspapers and the media generally, the political unaccountability, as it were, lack of democracy or control or oversight of the media. That can be part of a democratic deficit. So the democratic deficit can be our constitution, our voting system, our political parties, their internal workings, you could say, were undemocratic. So the solution might be more democracy. So in H.L. Mencken's term, we need more referendums, we need citizens' juries, we need more devolution, we need more power to devolved assemblies and more devolved assemblies, maybe regional governments in Britain. Maybe we need more powerful and responsive local governments. And, Britain has an awful lot less democracy than the United States. In the United States, we have though they could, open to many, many criticisms of the American political system, structures, parties, pressure groups, elites, and money can be aimed as criticism of the American system, we might well say they've got an awful lot more democracy than we have, which might lead us eventually, if we keep looking at the democratic deficit, to wonder whether more democracy is always the answer to the problems of democracy. Maybe accountability, maybe openness, maybe for instance, it actually makes us more democratic to have a Bill of Rights, to have the protection of minority rights, to have a legal system where that reflects the population, instead of old judges drawn from an elite of public school educated, Oxbridge educated, narrow bunch of universities. That is a democratic deficit not because you want judges to be elected, but you want judges to at least look like the population. That could be another example of the democratic deficit. So in the United States, there's far more democracy. Whether that makes them Whether that solves the problem of a democratic deficit, well, that's open to debate. But certainly, if I were to be a citizen of the average American city, say Peoria, I've been to Peoria, actually, it's in Illinois, it's a very nice place. But in a citizen of Peoria, in their lifetime, the different kinds of elections they might vote in, take part in, different kinds of elections. So, for instance, a citizen of an average city like Peoria, Illinois, will elect the mayor, will elect the city council, might be involved in elections for school boards, might be elections for library boards. These are local democratic structures. At the lowest level of American politics, there's a lot more local government. People often vote in American government, in local politics, for people that represent them on the library, the school board, on the water board. I'm not sure about Peoria, whether the water board, the water authority that's elected. We have something like that in police and crime commissioners. New innovation, you might see it come from America. In many small towns, the sheriff is elected, or even the prosecutor is elected. In Peoria, above that, you've got the state. Besides the city and local government, you've got above that the state. You've got a state senate and a state house of representatives and a state governor, all of which the state house of representatives elected every 2 years, the state senators elected every 6 years or so. The state governor elected every 4 years. And above the state system, you've got the federal system. So you've got the electing the president every 4 years. You've got electing the House of Representatives every 2 years. You've got electing the state senators every 6 years. You've got two of those. So and that's besides all the opportunities you might have to vote in referendums. So many American states use referendums. They use recall elections. You can recall politicians. You can initiate referendums through initiatives, and through a wide range of democracies. America's got a ton more democracy than Britain. The average citizen of a British town might vote for local government, very weak local government, very limited influence over the world they live in. They might vote regularly in parliamentary elections, so local government elections, a town council, maybe a mayor. Above that, if they don't live in Scotland, if they live anywhere in England, above that is Westminster, so parliamentary elections. They don't directly elect the president. Because we don't have one. We have a parliamentary system. We elect the parliament, from which the government is selected. It's a fused system. So in Britain, we might maybe an average Brit, and of course they can't vote in European elections anymore because we've left the EU, so we've lost a bit of democracy there. You could argue there's a democratic deficit even greater now we're outside Brexit, outside of the EU. In the sense that while we were in the rather undemocratically constructed EU, we had some democratic influence over it, whereas the EU still has a tremendous influence over Britain in all sorts of ways. We have to negotiate with the EU, as our nearest and biggest nearest trading relationship for many decades to come. We'll always have some kind of relationship with the EU, but now we don't have a particularly democratic influence over that. So we have Europe probably still influences Britain without there being much political, democratic influence over it at all. We're not part of the European Parliament. We don't have commissioners on the European Commission. So you could argue we've even got an even worse democratic deficit now we're outside the EU than there was when we were inside the EU, since EU regulations will, to some degree, have an impact on Britain for years to come, through some sort of negotiation or compromise. Well, so if you were to unfold the democratic deficit, you would look at the unelected House of Lords, the unelected head of state. You would look at the dominance of the executive, look at the weakness of Parliament in relation to the executive. You look at the dominance of Parliament in relation to the other institutions in Britain. You look at the unfair voting system. You'd look at the power of elites and pressure groups, unelected trades union leaders or unelected business leaders and controllers of social media, and on it goes. And you might say the answer is a rejuvenated democracy, more democracy, new types of democracy, fairer voting systems. And all of these things will be used to answer the problem of the democratic deficit. if you want to contest the idea, the accusation, the criticism, just like of the democratic deficit, if, for instance, you were, when we were still in the EU, if someone wanted to say, well, I disagree that you can describe the EU as having a democratic deficit. You can say the commissioners are indirectly, they're appointed by democratic governments. They can propose laws, but those can be vetoed by a more democratically elected parliament, since it uses a fair voting system, a regional list system in the UK, to elect members of the European Parliament. And as for the Council of Ministers, well, they are all elected politicians from their various governments. I mean, the system in Europe, you could argue, wasn't any greatly less democratic than a parliamentary system with an unelected House of Lords, an unelected head of state, and an unfair voting system which produces governments that are routinely represent only a minority of the electorate, and are always a minority choice when you add up the votes for the other parties. So Britain wouldn't stand up particularly. Well, that's why I think the term democratic deficit is so easily transferred to a generalised criticism of the UK. If you want to contest that, though, and say, well, I don't think that Britain has particularly a democratic deficit, you then start to get into a debate about the various bits. So, for instance, the unelected House of Lords, and you say, we're going to look at this. You'd say, well, the unelected Lords has a number of advantages, even hereditary peers. You can certainly make a case, I think a difficult case, but you can make a case for hereditary peers. You can make a better case for an unelected House of Lords. It becomes a kind of strangely selected citizens' jury in a funny kind of way. Or expert citizens' jury. You can argue this. So you can argue for strengths of the House of Lords. You can argue that the dominance of Parliament by the executive, the so-called elective dictatorship, besides being an exaggeration or a ridiculous kind of oxymoron, you can also say that there's many advantages in having a strong executive, because governments can come to power able to do that which they were given a mandate to do. In the United States, for instance, which I said has far more democracy than the UK, you can argue that many American governments come to power and find they can't do the things that they spent, presidents this is, many presidents in the United States come to power unable to do the things that they spent years campaigning on. So, for instance, in 1992, Bill Clinton came to the presidency with a mandate, you could argue, to reform healthcare, which he'd mentioned many times in his campaign, and was unable to do it. And there are multiple times when presidents of the United States have a contested mandate. In other words, Congress sees its mandate quite differently to the mandate given to the president. Well, that means they might well look longingly, as some American presidents have, at the parliamentary system and realise that when governments are elected, they can enact their mandate. For better or worse, but they can do it. And that might mean the government in Britain is more responsive, more able to do those things. If there is a high demand for government to do something, the other day I was thinking it was 10 years now. Was it 10 years? 10 years since the Dunblane massacre, or was it 20 years since the Dunblane massacre? Let me think now. I think it might be 20 years since the Dunblane massacre. That was a terrible massacre in primary school in Scotland, where children were shot by a lunatic with a couple of handguns, which he held with licensed handguns, went into a primary school in Dunblane in Scotland, shot primary school children, and almost immediately, within a few months of that happening, all handguns had been made illegal in Britain. That simply could not happen in America, no matter how egregious and appalling the massacre, it simply couldn't take place. Governments can do things in Britain. If there's popular demand, they have a big majority, they can do things. So that sounds so undemocratic, actually, that governments can do the things that people want them to do. It might sound more undemocratic to disperse power, where a system of checks and balances and separated power in the United States often means that government is weak and limited. So you have a powerful democracy unable to do the things that people might want them to do. As for pressure groups, well, you could take an argument there, as we will look at when we look at pressure groups, and say that although pressure groups are internally not particularly democratic, and maybe some of them have tremendous influence, take the pluralist view of pressure groups, but there's always another pressure group to represent an alternative view. So maybe trades unions are powerful, but they are counteracted by representative groups of business and corporations. And corporations are powerful, but they are counteracted by environmental groups, and so on. You could take a more pluralist view of pressure groups. And on you could go. Devolution, you could argue that devolution is... there's been a steady transfer of power to Scotland, a steady transfer of power to Wales, even with questions like the West Lothian question, the problems with the power of the Scots politicians over English issues and so on. We look at the West Lothian question of the time. But if you wish to contest the democratic deficit, you might take it issue by issue, and you might argue overall that the democratic deficit can be countered. Where you get more democracy, you get less efficiency. Where you get more democracy, you get more dominance of the majority. Where you get more, yes, and so on. So it isn't necessarily the case that there is a democratic deficit. If you want to argue against the democratic deficit, that is how you would do it, probably piece by piece. Now, one answer to the democratic deficit overall is to rewrite the rule book. And we'll look at the question of whether Britain should have a codified constitution, whether that would solve the problems of the democratic deficit, solving problems like maybe codifying the voting system, codifying the limits to both prime ministerial power, and so on. So again, that becomes... So a series of the questions about the democratic deficit will occur as we look at different issues in the British Constitution and the British Constitution itself. Now, the American writer Pippa Norris, American academic Pippa Norris, wrote a book called something like The Democratic Deficit. I think I'll put the title up here. And she tried to come up with a sort of theoretical framework for understanding a democratic deficit. And she talked about three aspects, which was, I'm going to look this up now, demand, information and supply. And she says demand. I thought it's a really interesting idea. One of the reasons there is a democratic deficit is not just because of the problems we have structurally in voting systems and unfairnesses, but because people's expectations of politics, of democracy rather, have changed. In other words, we are a more educated population, we are a more aware population. This is where information comes in. People are more aware of the corrupt nature, like the cash for questions or cash for honours, or expenses scandals in this country. We're more aware of the problems of democracy. We're also more aware of problems in the world. So a more educated population with more information. That's the second point. So they've got expectations, demand. There's the greater demand for more democracy. There's greater information about the world. And a lack of supply, in the sense of the supply of democracy, the few elections, the unfair voting system. So while her analysis of the elected dictatorship follows traditional criticisms of the Constitution, that idea that people have changed and democracy needs to change with them. We'll look at a writer called David Runciman, who talks about democracies getting old, becoming middle-aged, in the sense that not only the population actually gets old, demographically gets old, but also democracies have to grow and evolve with time. They can't stand still. And so the democratic deficit might have been not so apparent in the 1950s, but more apparent today, because we know more, because we expect more than we did in the past. Well, there you are then, that's the democratic deficit. As I say, if an essay, to what extent does Britain have a democratic deficit, you might well point to the voting system, to the Constitution, to the influence of pressure groups, and so on. You've got quite a lot there. That's a big essay. And the counter to that is to deal with those one at a time, where you might defend those institutions, those practices. There are advantages with first past the post, there are advantages with unelected House of Lords. You might do that. And you might conclude overall a democratic deficit is an exaggeration. You might say that it applies in some areas and not others. That overall it's a very blanket term, very broad term. And it's certainly, you might argue, that in our voting system or in the unfair voting system, yes, democratic deficit there, but broadly not in other areas. So that's how you would answer a question like that, in a sense, is to form an idea about whether or not the term democratic deficit is exaggerated or can be justifiably applied to all areas of the British democratic system.